Hi, everyone. If you want to grab a seat, it's always a little early Friday mornings, but as someone said, the advantage of a big conference is that there's a lot of speakers, so the auditorium feels full immediately, but students will trickle in throughout the day, and everyone is very excited. I'm Amale Andraos. I'm the dean of the school, and I just wanted to say a few words of welcome and an introduction to Juan Herreros, who masterminded this with Enrique Walker. And we started to talk about this symposium early on last year, and wondering how I think Juan and Enrique, especially Juan throughout his seminars, have been looking at the question of practice and how it's become, in a way, a project in itself, but not in just this kind of say yes to everything, but rather how to find ways to engage, to push the discipline, to expand how we practice, and to really kind of continue to be creative and find agency. And in the conversation, we were kind of I was also commenting on the fact that it had been 10 years since Ordos 100, which in fact was a kind of moment of launching at least my generation of architects, and how there was a sense that this generation after was actually already operating in a completely different way, and that it was worthwhile digging into these modes of operation and to look at these modes, across different cities around the world, and to kind of have this sort of cross-section so that it wasn't so narrowly kind of focused on the US or Europe, or to kind of understand that some of the preoccupations that we have here are quite different. And in particular, we thought it was a really good way to encourage our own students to think about, how they want to launch into the world, and learn about how to, what are the means that we have to develop for them here. And so, on this note, I will give the floor to Juan, who I'm really, you should also know that those of you who are here are 20 amongst 100 that were kind of shortlisted, and one of the projects that we're thinking of is the life after this moment here together, where I think there'll be a series of podcasts and conversations, and ways to kind of create this kind of landscape of practices around the world. So please welcome Juan Herreros.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Amale, for the introduction and support of the Constructing Practice Symposium from the very, very first steps. And very especially for bringing to the school this question about the practice, because it's really necessary to insist in the need of talk about the practice as a pedagogical issue, as part of the education, as part of the training of the architects, because it's here in the schools of architecture where we can give a contemporary value and a significant redefinition to the topic. Thank you also to Enrique Walker for your complicity, and all you know Enrique with his fine-tuning formulating the to-the-point question all the time. We together curate the Transfer Dialogues series, and very especially the 2-on-2 sessions. These 2-on-2 sessions consist in the invitation to two offices to do kind of presentations like we have asked you to do today, and to open a conversation about the confronting contexts where I operate, and discovering that the differences are not always where it were supposed. Those conversations have been the laboratory of this event today. For us, the question of the symposium, as Amale has pointed, is that is founded in the idea that the establishing of their own office is a project in itself. It's an act of design, and in consequence, it's an intellectual exercise that blurs the borders between theory and practice. Today, we want to talk about this project with a bunch of young offices all around the globe established in the past 10 years. This is the first selection we did. Here you have 160 offices, more or less. And this is the map that shows something very incredible if we think what has happened in the last 10 years. No? All these offices are founded after 2006, and it's a discovery to know that you can find this kind of offices in every country around the world. The merit to be in this map, to be part of these 160 offices, is to develop any kind of critical practice of architecture that contributes to redescribe the context where they operate. So that was our first reason to select the names. The practice is sorted today after transforming these 260 into the famous 100 that are this response to 10 years after Ordos, are here because they saw a deep commitment in the selection of the topics, the influences, and the self-imposed constraints to work with. So we have been looking for practices that reveals a desire or show that the way of working and the method of producing architecture is really something that is done as they want to do it, no? And not as a consequence of circumstances that you don't think a lot about them. No? And they composed a selection of the present and I think an incredibly interesting photo of the next future of our discipline. Watching to the materials of the different offices we are going to have today, we could see that in the last years, we have discovered this collection of significant changes in the motivations and the concerns that have oriented the establishing of the new practices. This generation is deeply aware about the need of a new instruments to dialogue with the present, from geopolitical issues to environmental sensitivity, from material culture to the redefinition of the everyday as architectural material, from the impact of new technologies to the social equations that include all the political and global phenomena, from immigration to natural disasters. We have asked them to present for 15 minutes. Sorry for this pressure about compressing all your ideological universe in 15 minutes. But we want to know about your strategies and approaches to the discipline from the different regional contexts. And the questions are, how do you do what you do? And how do you respond to the concern about what kind of architect I want to be? So, if the traditional models are not the ones to follow, we have to invent, we have to design the new models. And because we are in a school of architecture, and because an ambitious expression of global thinking strategies is behind many of the practices invited today, we want also to know about we want to have a specific focus on the training of these colleagues and understand how the education they receive it has informed the decisions in the establishing of these practices. The session will be organized in 5 panels related to 5 kinds of practices. The classification of these 5 groups could be many others, but thanks to these maps, we have understood that there are some particularities that can be interesting to think about them. The first is from global education to local practice, people who left their homes or cities to be educated abroad and came back or changed the place where the practice is done from. The second is the idea of from local to transnational, how in the last decades, we have discovered an incredibly intense and active group of small offices all around the world working globally that are quite far from the model of the exports of architectures that we could see in the decades before with the big architectural offices exporting architecture to the emerging economies. The third group is related to the redefinition of the idea of collaboration. So how the collaborative transdisciplinary work is today a new edition of the former groups of specialities, basically an architect helped by engineers with technically specialized in very different fields, but all of them around the production of the project, and how today we really deal and dialogue with many other disciplines and not necessarily close to the field of architecture. The fourth is about the material culture as instrument to design. This is also reivindication of the constructability of architecture, the desire of be built, so and how materiality is a new global way of thinking through the engagement with local technologies. And the last, fifth, is norm core, and is, I think, an interesting conclusion about how we can give new values to neutrality as a critical attitude, and how perhaps preserve the discipline in terms of the practice from a neutral attitude can be really a very, very intellectual and deep position. Before inviting Enrique Walker to come to the front to introduce the first panel, I want to thank to all the staff of the fourth floor who are over there, who have worked like crazy to make possible this intense journey. We hope all of you got this pamphlet, which is a good present for early birds, because we don't have so many. But this is easy to open, and you will be able of adding more pages, and the pages will be in the web site of the school with the bios of other offices who are not here today, and that will be increasing the files of these emerging practices research that today is starting or really is being public, but at the same time is only the first of the congresses that we hope to do in the next future, together with this podcast that have been also announced by Dean Amale Andraos. And thanks to the PhD candidate Esteban Salcedo, who has driven all the research and the production of these diagrams that made visible many unexpected ingredients and of the emerging offices, and helped us to detect, as I told you before, the different kind of practices we were looking for. If you are here, you have crossed the corridor or the small, what we call the tunnel, where some of these diagrams and images of the work of the offices invited are there. So it's part of the materials that you will be able of finding in the web of the school. So I think that's it. We have a whole day to talk about architecture and establishing of the practice. Thank you, and enjoy the presentations, and let me invite Enrique Walker to the front to present and to introduce the first panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome to Columbia GSAPP. My name is Enrique Walker. I direct the Advanced Architectural Design program at the school. It is a pleasure for me to introduce the first panel of our symposium, Constructing Practice. The panel is entitled Global Local, From Education to Practice, and brings together three practices who decided to operate in and from their home city or country, following an architectural training experience abroad. We are delighted to have as guest speakers Max Nuñez, whose practice is based in Santiago, Chile, via New York, GSAPP indeed, welcome back. Jiangxiang He and Ying Jiang from O Office, based in Guangzhou, China, via Leuven and Versailles. and Salvador Macías and Macias-Peredo from Macias-Peredo, based in Guadalajara, Mexico, via Barcelona. Tay Carpenter from GSAPP will act as moderator. Please join me in welcome our first speaker, Max Nuñez.
Hello to everyone. Thank you guys for the invitation to be back in Colombia. I believe architecture is something you never stop learning, acquired throughout time, in a very long term, by constantly looking, discussing, and designing buildings. For me, this education started at a very young age, as I am son of an architect. But going to architecture school is certainly a key moment of this learning process. I studied architecture at Universidad Católica de Chile in Santiago at the end of the 90s, beginnings of the 2000s. The school at the time was still very isolated from the rest of the world, but the scene was beginning to open and new ideas were emerging. There were at least two important references which represented opposite ways of understanding the idea of context. The early work of Matthias Klotz, to the left of the image, with his pure static boxes, suggested an abstract and distant relation with any notion of place. He emphasized a strong figure background contrast through simple structures, proposing a totally silent architecture. On the other side, to the right, the early works of Smiljan Radic, by means of an as-found sensibility, offered a connection with the landscape and its building traditions. Through rough materials and basic means of construction, he established a very symbolic, layered, and rhetoric approach to context, in total opposition, in a way, with Klotz's strategy. During my last year at architecture school in Santiago, my classmate Bernardo Valdez and I received the commission to do this house. At the time, we had little notion of what we were doing, but many of the decisions laid down on this small house are ideas that still matter to me today. For example, how a specific topography can alter the established notions of a given program. Also, the neutralization of the free plan by means of the domestic life, and the problematic relation between two or more structural systems working at the same time. In any case, with this house, we were trying hard to do something different from the total abstraction of Klotz or the sensible materiality of Radic. The success of that house, of that first commission, translated into more work. I established a partnership with my friend Nicolás del Rio for almost 6 years, and we worked non-stop designing a bunch of private houses. Some of those projects are shown in this image. Most of these projects were located in distant regions of the country, in very diverse geographies and climates. This characteristic diversity of the Chilean landscape translated somehow into our work. In consequence, we were always trying to do something different, experimenting with new materials, structures, and developing various building types. This was the work of DRN architects. But in 2008, this happened to all of us, I guess. We all remember those days. And in Chile, like everywhere else, we were like this guy in the photo, going home with not much to do. But instead of staying in Santiago, we decided, me and my partner at the time, we decided to leave and study abroad. We applied for grants of the Chilean government, and we closed the office and later split the partnership. I wanted to see, in a way, how the real crisis looked like, so I came to New York City, to Columbia, to the Master in Advanced Architectural Design between 2009 and 2010. In retrospective, I feel that the atmosphere in Colombia those years was also in a turning point. The economic crash had eclipsed the ideal of the star architect, and the digital parametric moment was no longer in the center of the discussion here. There was a strange atmosphere, but in a good way, extremely challenging, in which no one knew which direction to take. This was great because there were no leading trends at the time. Let's say that this was just before the axonometrics of San Rocco and everything that associated with it. For me, Columbia had a profound effect, especially the very critical approach to design of some of its key professors and studios, which offered a kind of psychoanalytical experience for someone who had been practicing for a while. In particular, Enrique Walker's studio, which proposed the dismantling of architectural cliches, made us really conscious of our design potentials, tics, and limitations. Looking back, this academic experience offered me awareness in very architectural terms of how I wanted to move forward. Max Nuñez Arquitectos was established in 2010, right after completing my master. To be frank, my practice can only be described through the buildings we have done and the ideas revolving around them. These ideas have appeared in the process of designing, and many times even in retrospective after finishing construction. And these are quite old ideas, I guess. I suppose we're definitely not avant-garde for a place like Columbia. We're much more like rear-guard. Rather than declaring a conscious plan in relation to my practice, as requested by Juan in his kind invitation to the symposium, I prefer to declare that I work with a constellation of thoughts, a very pretentious name that now that I see it so big. But these different terms help to link in a way what we've done in the office. These are 6, or actually 7. Here you can see 6, but there are 7, which is a better number. These are 7 priorities which are not thought in strict academic terms. I believe it's more about free interpretation, association, and where possible, misreading of these ideas is totally allowed. In each project, these themes can be found working together or separately. They can overlap, or maybe you won't find them at all. Don't worry. They do not offer in any way a final answer to my work, and don't seek to give a formal totality or seamlessness. Each project has its own complexities, and in accepting those complexities lays the true potential from which to discover, hopefully, something new. The first idea, I'm going to go really fast through these concepts. Topographical patterns, this strategy in relation to context aims to dismantle the very Chilean cliché of the autistic object set in the landscape, and also avoids any kind of subjective rhetoric. The idea is that a closer negotiation between the building and the pre-existing topography can redefine some preconceived internal organizations of domestic life and establish a more dynamic relation with the ground. A very simple and beautiful example of this hypothesis is how Asplund, in his Gunnar house, brings an exterior condition of the landscape, its sloping topography, right in the middle of the center of the domestic life. Here he collapses the stair and the chimney while slightly rotating the direction of the floor plan in the living area. A second concept, one of my favorite buildings is the Lovell House by Rudolf Schindler in the south of LA. As you may know, it's a relatively small house in a generic seaside location, but here the vertical structure is visibly exaggerated. By means of their huge size, the columns are somehow denaturalized, bringing excessive magnitude in a rather ordinary program. The result of this oversized arrangement is a generous shaded public space below the house, where the sand of the beach originally touched its feet, as you see in this old photo, giving a public condition to a totally private house. The house and its robust structure appears to me as a domesticated, gigantic monster that allows human life to unfold between its legs. Schindler's strategy redefines the domestic by radically changing the size of one of its architectural parts, exaggerating one of its elements to monstrous proportions. Other possibility of questioning the domestic, questioning the domestic is given not by a change on scale, but by excessive quantities or repetitions of one of its elements. Even though this project for a cathedral by Boulez is not a domestic space, it serves to make the point about quantity. The extreme repetition of a single column to the infinity blurs the distinction between wall and column, potentially dissolving the limit between inside and outside. This excessive repetition gives the column an ornamental quality beyond its basic structural purpose. This is obviously referencing Robert Venturi's definition of the double functioning element. I'm really interested in the way this double functioning cancels or dissolves the individual aspect of the combined elements, resulting in unique architectural objects. As you see in the photograph, the simultaneous patio, window, skylight, column at the center of the music room in Ritoque is an indivisible element which don't even, I mean, you can even name it. It's an element without a name. The redundant structure or redundancy in a structure, I see it as a way of escaping the tyranny of the boring solution of the flexible floor plan, could be by giving a closer attention to the friction between space and material structure. As the only present element in a free plan is the structure, it has a potential for spatial determination without imposing a particular use. It can promote a definitive expression of something in itself generic. In this photo, it shows the extreme misalignment between structure and space. It is as if Shinohara was lifting the middle finger to the open free plan, yet keeping it still unspecific in its use. Another beautiful example would be the Tama Library by Toyo Ito. Material and expression, I'm interested in not obvious or easy tectonics, like Michelucci's interior of the Chiesa dell'Autostrada, where he plays with concrete as if it was a soft textile, a stalactite, or a stalagmite, all at the same time. And the final concept is an idea about useless space. Today, it seems that architecture's discourse has been influenced by an urgent call for social relevance, problem solving, down-to-earth solutions, bottom-up approaches, efficiency, and immediate impact. I know that architecture must face the problems and conditions of its time, and these are difficult times indeed. This declared fear towards excess and misalignment is a conservative tide that could endanger the existence of the useless in architecture. And actually, for me, the uselessness is the quality that I most enjoy of a building. Today, at the office, we're doing different kinds of projects, private and public, and doing an average of two competitions every year. I also teach at Universidad Católica, and I am head of its Master in Architecture program. Usually the studios that I teach revolve around the ideas that I just mentioned. To finish, I will go super fast over 3 projects, hoping that the previous ideas somehow reflect on my work. I won't go into much detail, really. The first project is a house, the Gut House, which is located in a very steep terrain. I just wanted to show these sections from foreigners looking to South America. The first is by Alexander von Humboldt, where you see that the whole continent is this massive mountain, the Chimborazo. And the second drawing is done by Le Corbusier, where he depicts the city of Buenos Aires, the Atlantic Ocean, and then this huge, massive mountain that dips into the Pacific must be Chile, which is just that thing. Which I think it's nice because that's a very, it's a nice way to see our geography, and that's something that has interested us in every project, how the relation between the built object and the topography and which relation they establish. So this is a recurrent idea. The house maybe it's the most radical in this sense, and replicates the slope of the terrain, bringing that condition to the interior and somehow redefining the domestic spaces inside of it. On top of this roof slash surface is a huge stair with somehow gigantic proportions, also not so much linked to a domestic dimension. And the idea was to place this, the idea of an open floor plan, but in this sloping terrain, and how this topography could alter the idea of the open floor plan. The space is supported by these 15 columns. The idea is that each column should be different in order that you don't really read that easily the grid. So each point, each column it's a point of reference in itself. And then some private areas will protrude these different surfaces. The idea that this surface also blocks the view to the horizon was something that we wanted to do. And the misalignment between the interior, the exterior, the structure, the enclosure, so that there's not an easy distinction between when you are in and out of the house. The second project is a small arts department building inside a school, a private school. This school is characterized by neoclassical buildings from beginnings of the 20th century. And we wanted to bring to the interior of the school some kind of exterior space where the kids could really interact in a very free way, an unexpected way. The idea was, first of all, to clear the first floor plan, so the program was divided into a second floor and a -1 floor. So through these huge columns that you see here, which act as a column, as a patio, as a skylight, these 3 levels were connected. The building is just in the center of this school, which is like a big campus. So this covered space acts as an open link to connect these different areas and buildings. Obviously establishing some kind of dialogue between these huge columns and the existing columns of the old buildings, the trees, etc. These small skylights are like, it's a building with 5 cores, which was also something that we hope tried to dismantle the idea of an open free plan the moment you repeat many times one element. And the relations that are established through these voids are quite unexpected. They also work as windows because they have this opening, so there are different relations that you can establish between these three levels by this one single oversized column. These are the interiors. The idea of the classrooms is that they were not the normal relation between student and professor, having a room with many corners. It's not like a frontal room as this auditorium, but it's much more complex in its floor plan. That's the column. These are the plans of the columns. And I really like this photo, like this gigantic monster, yet tamed somehow by the life of the school and the kids playing around it. And the last project, I'm going to go really fast. It's a house in a suburb, in a really ugly suburb, as many suburbs around the world, in every big city. But we wanted to work with 2 conditions: a structural system that is not usually used in Chile, which is the tilt-up system, and the other idea was keeping all the trees that existed in the plot, which are normally cut down and thrown away. These two decisions changed the layout of a suburb house into a much more expanded floor plan, and a house with no specific form, in which all the rooms have at least one patio. And the idea of giving some kind of unity to this whole mess of a floor plan was by repeating one column 400 times, a concrete column that we would do in situ at the site, and this column helped us to generate these in-between spaces and try to blur again the distinction between inside and outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our second presentation this morning is O Office. So please join me welcoming Jiang Xianghe and Ying Zhang.
Good morning. We have great pleasure to be invited here to share some of our practicing experience here. Because we are using the term, excuse me, because I will represent all of this to speak because it's easier to keep in time.
Only 15 minutes, it's difficult to...
We have the topic of the region, not because we are really deep into the understanding of the region. It's because in our young children's memory, we don't have any idea about region. In our early age, I think the only thing we have in memory is the small town we are living. And then in school, we are talk about the whole nation, the country. So there is nothing about the region. But throughout our education in Europe and also our practicing in the past 10 years, I think more and more we trying to emphasize in the effort in regional regeneration or kind of self-cultural recognition in our location, in our region. And this is the image. It's in the Po River Delta area in 1970s. So you see the ethnic rising up, self-made ethnic rising up from the local house, and the telephonic signals from Hong Kong probably receiving to this house, and people start to have the view of the image of the modern city like Hong Kong or Manhattan at that moment. So it's kind of a hidden strength of the later urbanization of the whole region. 40 years later, the whole region becoming the world's largest metropolitan area. So with the population more than 100 million in this region. And the city growing, still continuously growing, so nobody knows where it will go. And this picture, this photographic work shows vividly the typical scenario of Po River Delta city, the new city mise-en-scène, according to us, the rising up from the original city, and everything come into kind of urban development. But of course, at the same time, another side of foundation of all of this is the education background, both me and Ying in Europe. So these two sides of like a mirror system that funding the philosophical foundation of all of this. This is Ying and me. It's also a kind of mirror system to us. We work closely every day, and even we fight against each other every day for design discussion in the office. And this is our studio in Guangzhou. It's on top of a silo building, an old industrial silo building near the old downtown Guangzhou. We have a very young team, and everybody works closely into a team. And everybody is very flexible in moving in one project from the other, so that we have a very dynamic relationship to work in a whole team. This is the silo office in the downtown, old downtown Guangzhou. And this picture showing that some of the main projects realized by OAF in this Po River Delta region. Probably you can see the diversity of all this project. The diversity of this project, I think it's, from one hand, it's the our response to each specific spot, the local condition and the local technical issue, social issue. But on the other hand, we are enjoying to test or to make a new experiment in each specific location and point. Because we can see later, the whole region actually is far more complex than only one megacity. Again, we have this kind of population density map for the whole Po River Delta. So we have kind of hyper infrastructure linking all this cluster of city and townships together into a so-called mega metropolitan area. And all of this realized projects are scattered in this area, probably as this picture shows. And but considering the different geography, a large amount of immigration to this area, and or different language in this region, because throughout the history, actually the southern China area actually is in different period, they have immigrants from different provinces. So different languages, different group of people, and so it's full of diversity in this region. So it's far more complex than what we can see here, physically see in this map. And again, we're back to the topic of education. So I study and work in Belgium. I got my master program in Leuven. Of course, we both share very similar academic background. We both graduated university in Guangzhou, a local university. And then I went to Leuven, Belgium, University of Leuven, and Ying went to Versailles, school, architecture school in Versailles, in France. So I think the most fundamental thing that those education experience gave us is the so-called kind of independent way of thinking, critical in analyzing, and the critical position and independency in profession and practicing. That's a fundamental thing we have. But when we return to the Po River Delta region, it seems that we try to apply somehow the knowledge and what we have seen and what we have learned to this region. We got a lot of problems because the whole region, actually, you see from the picture, you have this huge infrastructure, highways and speed, and the skyscrapers growing from the old generation of the city, older generation of the city, and then everything comes into kind of economic and political flow. So everything is flowing like a gigantic ocean of urbanization. And as one of our former leaders said, the only existing thing is developing. So development and developing is the only thing we have here. So not other things exist. So we try to draw these two different practicing model in diagrammatic way. So the left one actually is kind of more contemporary European elite profession model. So each architect office has its own self-disciplinary organization to working within his region, his network, and local craftsmanship. And in the right side, we have the most efficient way of Chinese architectural and engineering office. So they just throw themselves directly into the ocean of urbanization. So they only care about market demand. So what the demand needs, they produce they directly and as fast as possible to produce the product to the housing and building product to the market. And now, because we already seen the speed and the changement and the disorder, the condition, and also so much uncertainty to us. So step by step, we try to have a kind of dual system. Of course, it's not a designed system. It's a system that developed or evolved throughout of our practicing experience for the past 10 years. So the dual system actually have the kind of core structure. Physically, probably it's the silo office we have. And then we have kind of a substructure that directly on each project we are working on. So, of course, for most of the project, it's not a physical one. It's kind of a virtual strategy to work on. So, in each project, actually, we not only design the building concept or the spatial concept, but also kind of a strategy, working strategic way to design the thing, because by this way, at the same time, we can catch the timing, because also we can directly react to the local condition, the local social, economic situation in a way. So it's kind of, from the core structure, we kind of deliver the concept or deliver the ideology, and then from the local substructure, actually a lot of feedback. So it's kind of cycling structure that help us to work, continuous work in this region. So again, we have a geographic map on this region. So it's we considered it from the central urban area to the nature. It's kind of a continuously situation. So now we are trying to use two of our projects to describe a little bit more how we work in each project and each location. So the first one actually is located to the coast area. So it's an abandoned Honghua dyeing mill. Actually, it's a significant industry monument built up in the early 80s. It's the first generation of collaboration of foreign investment and local cooperation way. And it's abandoned since late 1990. So in that way, because of the climate or the short distance from the ocean, so even only 15 years of abandoncy, it kind of classical relic atmosphere showed up in the site. So the first idea for this one, we try to remain the whole structure, the building envelope intact, and have kind of a new implantation into the space. So at the same time, on the one hand, we try to maintain the kind of scratness of the classical atmosphere, and at the same time leave a kind of open air, semi-open air space between the new and old, to leave a lot of space for a future art activity and future development. That's a basic idea to leave the project, because later we have a model and a drawing exercise in the office, but still, when the project go directly onto the site because the contractor and the workers are all local workers. So we have to deal with all of this construction methods and detailing again, all the thing, and then to try to, even later, because the first building, second building, step by step, we renovate the whole factory. And in the second stage, we even have a real on-site office in the factory. And as we, on the side, for this project, quite a lot of decisions are directly made, and a lot of detailing things are directly made on the spot or on the site. So we can see the result of this development for the technique, how to pour the concrete and how to build up the steel structure, or we work with the local contractor to try to embed this concept into that land. And that's the recent situation. So step by step, one by one, we renovate and occupy the whole abandoned factory. It becoming kind of odd commune for in this landscape valley far from Shenzhen city. The second one is the Photography Museum of Lanzhou. It's in another geography location. It's a mountain area quite in the north of Guangdong province. So this picture showing the old downtown Guangzhou, the landscape and old downtown, and in between is a new development rising up from the situation. And the old downtown actually has been decaying, and people are leaving the old downtown. And since 10 years ago, a Guangzhou curator curated a very special photography festival in this town. And 4 years later, she invited us to participate in the Photography Museum project. And conceptually, we try to have the Photography Museum within the old downtown, having similar structure of the surrounding city, downtown city. Of course, then we have a general building envelope to cover the whole structure. Again, modeling, and because of public project, so we need to have a footage of documentation. And before we start the real construction, we also tried already renovate small houses on the street and to help to create the future development in the old downtown. But still, when the construction starting, lots of things, changement happen. Small things like the mistake in survey, and then later the shifting of the government power, and then material thinking. So almost the whole scheme are redesigned during the construction period. So, but still we have kind of local kind of substructure on the side, have kind of strong, we try to use the original concept to control the whole thing and still maintaining, try throughout this operation on the side to keep these things going. And that's the recent picture. And that's the street view for the nearly completed project. And funny thing is, it will open in 2 weeks, but the whole project is still under construction. Even the artists for the opening exhibition arrived yesterday. They found everything is still under construction. It's of course it's not always like that, but it's not exception when we practice in China, especially in local condition. So probably we need to have a kind of dual, maybe triple system to work in that.
I would like to add one thing, that actually in most of our projects we could not have complete design condition before our design, and the design requirement has been always keep changing, and sometimes the budget is not clear at all for us. So normally it is not a good moment for architect to study architectural design. But sometimes we see it as an opportunity for us because we could be involved in a very urge of design decision. And we can, how to say, work together with the client and try to influence them and guide them to kind of a design approach. And step by step to redefining kind of a long-term program. This is what I think always try to do.
Okay. Thank you.
Our last presentation of the first panel, Salvador, Macías, and Macias-Peredo.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to Juan, Enrique, and Colombia GSAPP for inviting us today. When we sat together and started thinking about what kind of things have given shape to our practice, we thought that we should talk about these ideas.
The things that move us, what inspire us about architecture, our academic studies, our professors and researchers. We also thought on necessity, and independent practice needs to self-employ. The location of our practice have played a key role in this. We wrote failures in terms of training. And lastly, we thought of the few assignments that have pulled out clear answers to deep questions, challenges where engineers were not necessarily required, but a profound intellectual work instead. Let us start by showing this image made by us that represents the moment when, for the first time, someone outside our country, the Architectural Foundation of London and Liga, asked us what our office project was through a collage. We put on the same level and same imaginary site the traditional Mayan hut and the Farnsworth house. We like to think that these two architectures are not so distant. Both establish a base that regulates the land, both set vertical elements that support a cover, and both use an open floor plan at the inside. For us, beyond technique, there are no significant differences between them. We wanted to refer to both simple approaches to describe what our office was looking for. We were born and our office is based in Guadalajara, the second most populated city in Mexico. Guadalajara is the dot on your left, and on the right you see Mexico City. Historically, Mexico has been a centralized country. The relevant aspects of the country happen in the capital city. The great commissions are generated there. Architect Luis Barragan, for example, was from Guadalajara, and he eventually moved to Mexico City, and that was the only way he could belong to the country's cultural and intellectual circles. Therefore, starting an independent practice outside the capital inevitably led us to start a local practice. We have always returned to this city, and from here we are interested in being able to continue doing our work. The great boom and growth of the city came in the 20th century. It came along with the importation of foreign architecture models, mostly modern, Corbusian models, like you see here, but also there was the group of Mediterranean influences led by Barragan's vision on weather and local techniques in his emerging architecture. The teachers who had an influence on us, and first architects with whom we worked, had a preference for the techniques and the language of the second one. In any case, as in all of Latin America, these architectures were made with the economy and the resources that were available. This type of architecture for us had been the most ordinary and familiar. It wasn't until we decided to leave the city and move to Barcelona for our masters that we found a kind of mecca of Latin American students doing all kinds of researching about architecture in their context of origin. And of course, a great interest by many of the professors on Latin America. Suddenly, the familiar took another dimension. We gave it a different reading and meaning. When the time to choose our own research topics came, our tutors in Barcelona, like Josep Ketlas and Jaume Rosell, encouraged our intuition to study our territory from the eyes of two German artists who had a great influence and interest in Mexico. On one side, you see the analytic Bauhaus professor Josef Albers, and on the other, Matthias Geritz, an extraordinary artist who came to Mexico to introduce some of the principles of the Bauhaus into the schools of architecture. Somehow, by being at Barcelona, we rediscovered and had a deep look over our backgrounds through the both of them. About 8 years before, Salvador and I met on a trip to see primitive architectures in Veracruz. Several routes would come later throughout Mexico, and those journeys together left a deep impression on us and marked the beginning of our history and a common interest about the primitive and the vernacular that keeps captivating us until now. This we shared with Geritz and Albers. In fact, these images are from one of many photographic studios of form and geometry made by Albers during his trips to Mexico. We discovered through them a great capacity of analysis and synthesis, of abstraction of many of these kind of structures that we had also been interested in. For example, this is the floor plan of Ciudadela Square, a very important sunken plaza at the pre-Hispanic urban site of Teotihuacan that Albers studied. The argument of the thesis was that Albers was painting abstractions of concave or convex spaces, squares or courtyards like the pre-Hispanic ones, an exercise that he repeated for more than 30 years in the homage to the square as it is well known. And on the other hand, the sculpture of Geritz, always influenced by this primitive and so rooted Mexican monumentality. We returned to Guadalajara from Barcelona at a time of global economic crisis, and although we were eager to do things, there wasn't much work to do. We had the opportunity to get into our university to teach, but we needed to look for other ways to self-employ us. So we designed a methodology that would imply leaving the city, leaving the country, and that would keep us studying, analyzing, fitting our practice from other contexts. Each one of these images represents study trips or workshop trips that we arranged in our office as if they were any other project, which had a specific place and a specific subject, and a group of architects, students of all ages were involved. This put to the test the methods we had learned from Albers and Geritz about absorbing and abstracting the experiences of the world. For example, this is a villa of vernacular houses we visited in Japan, and this is a common thatch roof or palapa roof at the Pacific coast in Mexico. These kind of confrontations promoted that our ordinary and local challenges became a deposit of possibilities and an opportunity for new synthesis. Somehow we were looking to the same, just differently. And in this going back and forth, we needed to be aware of how things are done in the place we do architecture. What are the existing skills on those who build, and how to keep a dialogue with them. This is a plane made of clay we acquired in a craft market in the city of Lima, Peru. This object reminds us of significant ideas. On one hand, it represents the progress of technology, the globality of the world. It speaks of our time. However, it doesn't fly, it only represents the idea of flying. We see the transnational sign of Air France with Peruvians aboard and Peruvian flags. For us, it speaks of a global aspiration, but at the same time, a strong relationship with a specific locality. We used to think that we were these Peruvians returning home every time, understanding that that's where we wanted to place ourselves, between the understanding of our geographical and sociocultural situation and the needs and aspirations of our time, which are inevitably global. Let me talk a bit about how locality has played a key role on our practice. Guadalajara is today a city of artisans. The artisanal workforce is still an important and current issue, and construction is not exempt from this. Experimentation in the construction processes are still viable and at a reasonable cost. This is a great opportunity. All throughout Mexico, actually, but in the case of Guadalajara, the need to get our first independent works forced us to build our initial projects. Culturally, the idea of an architect is closely linked to construction there. Hiring an architect to only develop design, it's a luxury for a few experienced offices. We took advantage of that moment, building together with these craftsmen, learning so much from their skills, but also about economy, local resources, etc. This made possible a work founded at the very practice, the construction, the performance of the building site. To take over the logistics and administration as a general contractor demanded a lot of time. It was taking away too much space for reflection. So we decided to found our current office, just bringing in the attitude of involving ourselves in the building process without the contractor role. It is common to hear, are you the kind of architects who build or those who only design? We like to say that we are right in the middle. Back to the moment of our returning from Barcelona, the opportunity to supervise the construction of this Carmen Pinoza's tower in Guadalajara came. As a local office, the task was to translate her intentions to the most traditional way of doing in Guadalajara. And this was a great challenge and learning that lasted 4 years. To know which things are suitable and which are not in terms of building in our city. Actually, Gerritz used to say that Mexico is a country where everything is possible. Something that has interested us about him is to understand how a foreigner becomes local and how he understands, in a very deep and clear way, the environment where he works. This is the only piece of architecture that Gerritz ever made, the Experimental Museum of El Eco in Mexico City. It was an architectural manifesto against the Mexican rationalist architecture of the 50s that he named Emotional Architecture. An annual contest of young architects is made to develop a temporary intervention to the patio that enables other ways to use the space, a bit like the PS1 program here. After our researches on the artist, we couldn't have been more thrilled to be chosen to participate. We had lost every contest we had done before, which had much more larger and ambitious programs than this. However, this one had such a special meaning for us. So we put all of our energy on this contest, and we were very lucky to win. After our building exercises at Guadalajara, we felt a great attraction for the only material who had no coating, showing its real age and its handmade process, the clay floor of the courtyard. We wondered if we could somehow make it evident. And on the other hand, Gerritz manifests himself by arranging the walls of the museum at angles that will never be 90 degrees. So we thought that we could establish a relationship with the building by lifting the floor of the patio, building a new diagonal. With this, we could erase the short wall that divides the museum and the street, building a bridge, a viewpoint towards the park that is in front of it. And at the interior, a natural forum towards the gallery. All these intentions made possible with one simple action. We felt that we came out with something that seemed that always had been there, or that could have been that way originally. Of course, we enjoyed the positive reactions towards the proposal, especially because it was our first project as Macias-Peredo studio. But it was the statement behind it that had a profound impact on our practice, to be able to say, this is the kind of architecture we want to do. Simple, discreet, fully integrated to the site, using its own resources, but powerful with clear intentions and that promotes events that change the user's experience. This became more of a question for the future, which we truly intend to give answers to in every new challenge we meet. As it happens in this image of one of our favorite photographers, Mariana Jampolsky, where with a simple action of arranging elements that are already there, somehow can transform it into experience and environment in the subtlest way. Both the ground and the walls are made up of the same stone, as well as the huts at the inside that are made with the branches and located underneath the shadow of those trees. Like happened in this inside piece, we wanted to take advantage of our first retrospective exhibition and talk about this performance of the building site we mentioned before. We thought of this tiny gallery as a site in itself. We got 33 tones of the leftovers from the same volcanic stone of the floor. The piece depended on the capacity of the hands that were going to execute the piece. We only designed the rules. The naturalness of the masons enabled the work. We reviewed the space of the gallery on our way, and since that day, one of the questions in the office is how to do projects where spontaneity and freedom have space, and that not necessarily everything has a determined, closed, and defined way when undertaking projects. At some point, our office map of projects started to expand. We are now working on an X-ray map of architecture tradition in different parts of the country to understand, with a quick reading, the typologies, systems, climatic circumstances, and resources that remain at hand of these sites. This for the upcoming Venice Biennale. Because in this expansion, we have learned from some failed experiences. This is one example, a Montessori school in Mazatlan, which needed to be built and designed in only 7 months. We did not have the time to do a proper reading of the site, and it became necessary to import experienced labor from other cities to be able to finish on time. It was a difficult process, although the image doesn't show that.
So, all of these experiences are fundamental on what we do now. And although we keep defining ourselves, we are focusing on producing an architecture that tries not to impose, but that seeks to be part of a continuity with the specific place and environment. Tries to absorb from the local, understand the place with the attitude of a foreigner, naively as a clear plane, but concise and synthetic as a German artist. No matter the scale, try to balance between the personal and the anonymous, the planned and the spontaneous, the Mayan hut and the farmhouse house. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you for sharing such personal reflections on your practice and giving us the behind-the-scenes look of how you're founding your practice and how you're maintaining it. And thank you for the opportunity to see all these practices in one place. I know that at GSAPP, the question of practice and models of new practice is constantly something that we talk about here. So thank you first. And it seems to me that the setup of the idea of global education to local practice, those terms are not so clear in how we're talking about it with this panel, I think. That one might imagine global as being fast, ubiquitous, slow as maybe being, or local as being maybe being more slow or isolated. But it seems like the way in which you're dealing with that spectrum of global education to then local practice is much more of a different kind of engagement in which each of your practices seems to be filters in some sense of those two lenses, and that each of you seem to, or each of the practices seem to kind of redefine a notion of a local, or to kind of to think through what extent does the word local actually, what does that mean in your practice? And how do we expand the idea? So it seemed, with Max, I thought there's an idea about a destabilization of the local in terms of the topography or the sort of typical approaches to, Chilean landscape. And it seemed with your talk, there's an idea about sort of intensification, like an intensification of local construction practices and craft. And then with you two, it's this, you even talked about it in your lecture, the conflict of how do you balance identity or memory of a region or a place then with the rising urbanization of China. And so I think that idea of a filter, this sort of expansion of a notion of local, to me seems really interesting within the context of the panel. And then I also want to go back to the question of the intellectual project of forming a practice, which Juan set up at the beginning. And maybe to have a sense of, in your talks, it seems like there's practices within the practice, that there's sort of a redefinition of practice at certain moments, right? And so maybe to begin with is just to think a little bit about the beginning and where you are now in your practice, and how did you sustain your practice early on when you first began, and the sort of economic equation of it, right? And then now, how do you uniquely maintain and maybe nourish the practice as it grows? And so I'd love to hear from each of you.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I think that mine is a very small office. We are normally between 3 to 5, maximum we've been 6 at the office. So the structure is very simple, and it has always been very variable, and maybe it's due to my going out of Chile for a while for studying or traveling and teaching at the same time. So for me, it hasn't been a goal to keep an office like a production or to grow in a very fast way. It has been more like a life cycle, which sometimes it's more intense, other times it's much more calm, and I get time to do other stuff. So I guess that the plan of the office is something it's much more spontaneous, like in its everyday functioning. And regarding the education and these experiences in Chile and abroad, I think it's a way of focusing on certain aspects. It's not about going out and learning something that you then bring to your country, but more it's going out to test what you've been doing before, looking at it again, and maybe fine-tuning on some aspects that you really want to, I don't know, be more radical or understand better. But I think that it's about, and I think that in that sense, the local aspect of things is fundamental. And in my case, yeah, this idea of topography and how this could affect the built object has been a key line of research.
Okay. Just a moment ago, I was talking about how Gerritz used to say that Mexico is a place where everything is possible. And I believe that in many ways it is true. I mean, Mexico is a place where there's much more freedom. You know, regulations are not so restricted, and this for the bad and the good. I mean, there are people that just simply jump over regulations, you know, which is bad, but when well intended, I believe there is a huge opportunity to do architecture. And so in our case, we have found that, you know, this thing that we also talked about how we are trying, or we are on our search, trying not to impose architecture over a specific context. We can translate that also in our way of doing architecture, in the process of doing architecture. I mean, in a place like this, in Mexico, just as I was saying, to the instructions of architecture that we can translate over a plan or our drawings become more like rules to play with. You know, we like to think that our work it has evolved, but in the way we do architecture, we try to think that the things that we specify are just more like a game rule sheet that is there for people to play with, that people can interpret those instructions or those rules into their own way of doing. And that helps us to have an architecture that is trying to have a dialogue with all these different actors that participate on that doing of architecture.
I'd like to try to go through a little bit our education and practicing experience, because we both educated in a local university, but when we graduated, actually the fast, the rapid urbanization just started. So we feel a little bit with both. Maybe we are not that used to that rhythm. So we found that we are losing in a way. So we choose to go abroad to continue to study and to observe in different culture. And of course, when you go from the very local China to Western Europe, so it's we felt, I think, directly a kind of cultural shock. So you don't feel easy at that, because completely different way of looking at city and architecture, and even questioning and reasoning methodology. So when we try to forget and to try to reinstall our knowledge structure, that's a really, I would say, choice is difficult, but to me, I felt refreshed. It's a very difficult moment when we arrived in Europe. But after 5 years of study and working in Western Europe, when we decided to return to that rapid urbanization, yeah, that we felt another cultural shock, because the speed of life is so fast when we return to China. So I think there is almost cannot have normal discussion about programming, about what we're going to achieve with the local people. It's very, very fundamental and very, very grounded question. That's why we rethink and retry to start from. Of course, we collaborate with other companies to design and develop a very big project in the beginning when we return. But we chose to another way. We chose to establish our own studio. In the beginning, we have only 4 people in this office, and we start from very tiny project, according to Chinese. So we try to, because at the moment people are still thinking architecture kind of a monumental thing. So theaters, museums, and so we try to re-establish in a really daily life way of architecture. So we create our studio and create small projects so people visit it. So from a very grounded and very daily way, we try to convince people to think and to work in a different way, I think.
Actually, we found in China for the moment, it's even difficult to keep a small office than become bigger. Become bigger, it's even easier because you can easily get a lot of projects without, if you don't care about the quality. And so normally now we have 15 to 20 people. And we have, because the project always change. I mean, the situation of the project always change. Sometimes it stops, sometimes suddenly it come back with even 10 times more. So we have to really keep a very flat and flexible working system. And of course, with this kind of developing pressure, it's very easier to lose. But we always believe that with tiny action, with interesting design strategy, we can influence a little bit. And step by step, it could be kind of, as Xiang saying, the daily life movement could become bigger and bigger and do something to, as kind of a feedback of the urbanization, the huge urbanization.
To start a kind of real conversation with people, with real space, not kind of images of cities and renderings of cities, exactly like that.
And maybe just to pick up on your point about the pressures of an architectural practice within different contexts. For each of you, are there, let's say, rules or guidelines that you use in your practice to maintain design values or design ambitions? So, for example, is there certain kinds of work that you actively try to engage? Are there, are there certain kinds of strategies that you use in your office to go for certain kinds of work? Are there things that you resist? You just described something you resist is not to grow. So I'm just curious about whether there's ways that you fight for the office that you want to have through a maintenance of rules or guidelines.
Well, I can talk about two. The first one would be that we try to keep ourselves having spaces for reflection, because when you go to the everyday practice, sometimes, the developing of projects doesn't give you time or room or space for that. So, for example, for us to be teaching at a university, or even to come here, today, to talk to Colombia and, force us to sit down and have, to make ourselves making questions and to go over our backgrounds and digging into our practice, all of those kind of things help us to do that, to have that space of reflection that sometimes you don't have when you have to do a project, in the specific time that is required. So that would be one of like a strategy. And another one, it's more, like you were saying, is a more intuitive, and is more a thing that really inspires us and that we really connect with, and is that we try to always look for, we try to see, or when, for example, we are trying to approach for the first time to a place, to a specific place, we try to look for the vernacular, the most common architecture, the people architecture. And it is a strategy that helps us to understand a place. We like to say that that kind of architecture doesn't fail. I mean, in terms of it reflects, it is a reflection of a place, and it is also, it has the wisdom of a specific place. So if it's important for us to have a good reading of a place, and we go and look to that primitive vernacular architecture, and that's like a kind of a strategy that we use, like very personally. Yeah.
think for this question, I think when we in the beginning when we just returned from abroad from Europe, I think I have quite a very structural and systematic mind to do things, to create a small office and to have goal to target and then what we. But later, I think more and more I think we developed in a more natural way, like because in a group like us in Guangzhou is quite exceptional. So you cannot set any goal that we need to for instance, we have new project and we need to recruit how many personnel, so 2 or 3, but you cannot find the right person. I mean, because as you know, the local education are completely different is what we are going to achieve. So if we don't, so we just continue to work on small group. But so more and more, if you work in people speaking in different languages, that will be a disaster. So to us, it's becoming, we don't have any specific goal for the future development, how to develop office. It's more a natural and daily natural flow in office. So if we have the right person to talk with, we can collaborate with this project or not. If not, we don't. If we have to get the right person in the office, we can have, because the whole office is like a family group. So we need to a kind of speak the same language and have the same value, not a structural way. So, I mean, I know it's more and more when we develop like that, office like that, the group like that, and it also can create interesting conversation when clients arrive and visit us. So they gradually or sometimes suddenly they understand what we should work together and what we should achieve in our future life. Because when we look at the city, the urbanization, that's I think more and more people will think about in living and working in another way. That's what we are.
Well, in my case, the relation with my practice and teaching has been a key aspect to keep the ideas of the practice somehow challenged by the works of the students, especially, and by the discussion that occurs inside the space of the School of Architecture, and that's a relation that I'm always trying to keep, and as a project in the future, the idea is to keep working in that way. Especially when you're working in a small office and you don't have that space of discussion with a larger group, it's important to bring those ideas to your students and discuss in different terms, maybe with more freedom and in different contexts. But I think for me that has been a very good conversation. And the other thing that I enjoy is to be in the different phases of a project, from its first stage until construction and all that's in between, and all the problems and travelings and discussions and solving problems during construction. And I mean, that's something that I really enjoy. So my idea of a practice is to keep it in a size that I can be, in a way, involved in all those different stages.
Maybe we have time for one question, 1 or 2 questions. Maybe I'll open up to the audience if there's a couple questions.
Thank you. Well, it's been very exciting to me to discover a pattern among your 3 practices. you've mentioned something that I really find essential, which is duality. You've talked about mirrors and mirrors that reflect Farnsworth House against the traditional hut. So, as if global and local were the two sides of the same thing. And it was funny to imagine you as a kind of double agent, as architects that were focused on created sophisticated links between things that looks completely different. And I assume that it implies to live in a kind of permanent sensation of estrangement and as real strangers or foreigners, as you said, in your own birthplaces. What I was really interested in knowing about is which are the tools that you deploy to show your neighbors that you are that your origins are the same than theirs, and how do you achieve to show you that what they really want is the unexpected, the other side of the reflect of the things that they think they want. As a local.
You mean from the point of view of the client?
Yeah, maybe the client, but not also the clients. Your teaching tasks or well, your surroundings. I mean, the environment you move in your everyday life.
Sorry, I understood the first part, but the question I didn't understand.
No, I didn't.
I'm sorry. No, well, I mean, which are your attitudes, the tools you use? Since graphic systems to negotiation techniques, to show them that what they really want is that they don't expect. What can you offer different to the other architects that as local, just because you've been global and you look global or you have a global perspective?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, because that would suppose that I have an opinion about the other architects that work in my same, and I don't know even how they work. So it's really hard to talk about how others would face the same problem. I mean, I have my way of working and I have my way of dealing with clients and contractors. And I hope I showed some of these ideas in my presentation, but it's not a strict norm, and it's always somehow adapting to the conditions of each commission and the discussions that appear from each architectural problem. It's much more something that you are working on constantly, rather than have a set of rules from which I design. And I mean, there are rules, but they're like a framework on which you work in every case differently, I guess. At least that's the way that I approach design. And in terms of this global or local issue, I think the distinction is very hard to draw today. I mean, maybe in the context of Chile, maybe 30 or 50 years ago, there was a very clear line between what you could understand as local versus global. But today, I think that's not anymore. And at least South America, I guess Mexico too, are continents, countries that are changing a lot at the moment. Well, China, it's the same. So it's, I think it's a super interesting conversation, but it's very hard to draw the line between what's global and local, and how what we have learned outside can be somehow rethought in the process of doing locally.
I guess that's exactly what can make it new or different to others. I mean, to get out of where you are and then come back. I mean, to that kind of confrontation, that's what makes it different, you know? I don't know how different from others, but that's basically the mixture of those things that makes something happen, you know? You take fragments of texts, ways of inhabiting the space, typologies, I don't know, environments, everything that enriches your work. That's exactly, you know, how local or how global, it doesn't matter really, it's the mixture of both. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Great, well we should probably move on to the next panel, but I suspect that the discussion will be ongoing throughout the day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much for this inspiring panel. I think we're going to talk a lot along the day about what it means to be local, foreigner, traveler, or observer, or whatever. The second panel is about this practice that today is becoming more and more usual of small offices working abroad. We could say then that transnational practice of emerging offices is transforming the classical idea of international architecture or architecture for sport, because these small offices are being able of create a very sensible and engaged relation with the context they work, very different from the context where they work from, and this dialogue is really important and necessary. So the question is not how to export architecture, that perhaps was the problem 20 or 30 years ago, but how can we be local in many places? How to bring to the locals a new reading of any environment we work in. So this idea of being a foreigner and showing the locals invisible values of the context they live in is the essence of this second panel. Samuel Barclay and Anne Jeanen are the principals of case design. They could be part of several of the groups today. But we have selected them from this discussion about from local to transnational. They are based in Mumbai, India, and they respond to contextual conditions working with makers, artists, and technicians in South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Fumika Simbura and Iko Kobayashi are terrain architects. Some of their projects are in Indonesia or Africa and are produced for very needy communities, making scarcity virtue and working with very local skills, materialities, and climate conditions. They also teach in Japan. Ingrid Moye and Christoph Zeller are based in Mexico City and Berlin, working in Mexico, Europe, Kurdistan, Iraq, and so on, and also teaching in different cities like London at the AA or Mexico Universidad Iberoamericana. And they are one of these, the third office, in the third practice for this panel. The moderator will be our dean, Amale Andraos, inspiring of the idea of global thinking that founds this symposium, whose book, We'll Get There When We Cross That Bridge, launched yesterday, tells the story of the flexibility of her office to understand different geographical contexts and social environments. So enjoy the panel and let us come to the front to Samuel and where are you? Okay.
Thank you. I went to school, undergrad, not too far from here, and always came to Columbia for a lot of these symposiums and lectures, so it's a great honor to be here. We appreciate it. Anna and I started working together about 4 years ago, and we both come from backgrounds where we were sort of very fascinated in making, in craft and workmanship. I grew up in my grandfather's workshops, where we were always doing sort of very different kinds of projects. Anna was sort of raised in a house that was being built as they lived in it. And so for us, the way that things come together and how they're assembled and the people who are making them is really critical to the way that we've always thought about our work. So the idea of who makes it, the idea of where is it made, and then of course what is it made of. We found, sorry, yeah, maybe I should lean forward. We found ourselves in India. I went there as part of graduate studies and sort of fell in love with the place and the way that things were made, the collaborations that you could have with craftsmen, doing the work that you're conceiving of, but also engaging with them conversationally to develop something incredibly rich. This is an image of a brick kiln. So the sort of race course around the outside are the bricks that have been made to put the space together. But what's always fascinated us is the sort of primitive nature that is still available in building technology. We can build the way we did 2,000 years ago, but at the same time we can build in pretty sophisticated ways. Despite the sort of primitive materials that are there, the artisans and craftspeople, again, that we work with are incredibly sophisticated. They are able to work with very, very detailed and precise materials. And out of that, we are able to engage with them in dialogues to sort of produce things that I just think wouldn't be possible in other contexts. So these are a series of door handles that we sort of take through sketch, through prototype. These are wooden samples on the bottom left that then get turned into brass, that then get put on a door and then eventually go into production. And so for us, this is such a treat to be able to engage with them again and create something that is not merely our vision, but also is a conversation that evolves through comfort and pragmatism and hopefully elegance and beauty. We also have a collection of sort of furniture and lights, things, again, that we've developed primarily out of projects. This has been a sort of organic offshoot of our architecture practice. Most of these have developed specifically for projects, but a lot of times they're simply a sketch that gets made, an idea, a conversation, a reference that we pick up. So a lot of what we try and do is also based on observation and then sort of following that up with the sort of intuition of how to take that observation that we've sort of looked at and translate that into something that is physical and practical and simple and hopefully, again, beautiful.
And in all of our architecture projects or interior projects or even the furniture, we work very closely with these craftsmen. And they're not, well, part of it is that they're the people who build it or make it, but they're also become very much part of the design process. And we always, like for most of our projects, we start construction even before the whole project is designed. Like as soon as there is enough to start, we start. And like we really try to leave a lot of things open to be able to make the decision when the time is appropriate. And this project, for example, was a small cafe in Dubai, but we constructed it and built it entirely in India in the workshop of our carpenters that we work with. And we came into the workshop with a sort of conceptual idea and a sort of general design, but the whole design was developed through collaboration with these carpenters, like all the details, how the construction worked. It was really a collaborative effort. And at the same time, we also make a lot of models that for us is a tool to not only understand the design and work on the design for ourselves and within our team and in our studio, but it also becomes a tool to communicate ideas, whether that's with a client, but very often also with people on site. Like all of our models always get a little dirty because we always bring them to the site, and we use them for in very different ways. And for example, the model on the right is much more refined and detailed and really tries to communicate the intentions that we have, and the one on the left is a quick model made from the earth on construction sites that just tries to quickly understand and talk about ideas with the construction people on site. And what makes our practice in India and in like all the projects throughout the world that we work on maybe different from a lot of practices that both of us come from Europe and the US, is the way drawings and models play a role through that design process. And what we always try to do, we don't see a drawing as a document that's fixed or that's static, and it becomes very much a tool to start a dialogue. And instead of these thick packs of papers of construction documents, we try to make as less drawings as possible, and a lot of our drawings are also made on site. And these two images the drawings are actually made by the people, like the people holding the pens are the people who are constructing the buildings. So they really become part of that design dialogue and that collaborative effort of creating the buildings. And apart from that design process, the way materials play a role in our practice is also very important. And that's the part where what is it made of, and that's of course very much related to this craftsmanship and these artisans who build it, and also the availability of materials in a lot of the places where we build. The image on the right is a mock-up for a school that we're building in India. And the use of a very cheap marble was in this case less expensive than simple plywood cupboards for storage. And just that discovery and that way of thinking is, for us, can only happen because we collaborate with the people who build it and because we go to the places where these materials are coming from.
This is an image of that same school, and the photograph on the top left, as you guys might recognize, are Picciones paving for the steps to the Acropolis. It's the photograph. I literally pulled out my phone, I showed it to our head mason, I said, this is what we want, how do we get it for next to nothing? So we began this conversation, and the image on the bottom left and the paving you see on the right is basically they would go to stone shops and take all the offcuts, right? And so literally the shops would try and get rid of it because normally they had to pay somebody to truck and take it away. So if we backed up with our truck, brought them to site, we were getting the material effectively for free, and it's just a little bit more investment in the craftsmanship and the time and energy and effort to lay it down. But again, it's a detail that there's no drawing of this anywhere. Even the lines on the ground of how it's laid out and the patterns are all just marked in chalk. As a full-scale drawing.
And we do make drawings in our studio, but we also very often, especially when it comes more to the details, the architects and designers in our studio make a lot of models, but very quickly in this process we engage the people who make it, and then we start making mock-ups to understand details or the way it's constructed, and through that process we come to the final design. And it's not, for us, it's to be local to be relevant for the place where we are constructing something doesn't always mean that we engage with local craftsmen or people who are constructing it. We also try to pull in collaborators from other parts of the world whose view or opinion we think is relevant for the specific project. And for example, this is the same school, and you see all these colored chimneys on top of the buildings. They are solar chimneys. The whole building is passively cooled, and we developed that system together with the climate engineers of Transsolar, who are based here in New York. So that was, but they've modeled with a digital model. They modeled the whole school and developed a system with us, which was very specific for this valley where the school was built in India.
We've also collaborated with, this is a friend of ours from Copenhagen. She's a visual artist who does a lot of work with color. So she was, just sent me a message one day. I'm thinking of coming to India. Is there anything that I can work on? So within, 1 or 2 days, we were on Skype. Another 1 or 2 days later, she had her plane tickets, and she came and using natural pigments, PVA, effectively Elmer's glue, and a mixture of lime and cement, she developed all of these colors for the school, which just adds a whole nother layer that we would not have been able to achieve with, with our, I'll say, limited knowledge. But it was really a valuable lesson for us that wherever we can sort of draw in these people who sort of share our values and our not just our vision, but just what we aspire to achieve in a place or in a context. Anytime somebody who shares that and has that expertise, we want to try and grab them and bring them on board.
We also started working on a project which is not in India, but in Zanzibar in Africa, where the presence of craftsmanship and, like, of course, the distance between our studio and building there is very different than the projects we've been doing in India so far. And but the way we've worked on it is quite similar. We again used a lot of models to not only understand and develop the design within our studio, but also to have that model as a document to communicate with the people on site.
These are some images, again, of sort of where the materials are coming from, how they're quarried. We jumped on a flight with the clients, flew over to the mainland, looked, sort of went up into the hills and found the places where the stone that we wanted to use would come from. So for us, again, the understanding of where the material's from, how is it processed, who's going to lay it down, and then really investing and engaging with those people to put it down in a sort of careful and thoughtful way. That sort of trust deficit that is naturally there between, I think, designers and builders is something that we work really, really hard to overcome.
And to achieve that engagement, for us it's very important, and we do this with every project, is to have a site architect, a person who is full-time present on site, who's not only communicating and sort of bridging the gap between what we've thought about and what the builders are building, but also can respond to that in a very intuitive and very quick and open way. So for the project here in Zanzibar, we have an Italian architect who worked in our office, who now lives in Zanzibar and is like working with these people, and he can really, it makes such a difference of being present there every day and being able to establish these relationships, to understand which of the builders is good in certain building certain parts and like trying to direct that, but also to have them be part of the problem solving that needs to happen on site, and to have their knowledge and their expertise brought into the project.
This image on the right is the client standing against the wall, and the gentleman on the right is a permaculturalist who's based in Zanzibar. He's from Germany, he's trained as a chef, his wife is from the Philippines, and they've just come to this island and sort of developed this, it's a school, they're developing a large residential compound, and they're really advising us on what kind of worms we need to propagate, how we build biomass so that we can construct soil. The entire site is basically just covered with rock at the moment. And so we're literally growing a farm. We cannot bring in soil, it just is cost prohibitive. So we're putting in things like papayas and bananas that you sort of grow it, cut it down, create the mulch to establish that fertile ground. The image on the left is a drawing made by our landscape designer, who's a friend of mine who works out of New Zealand. I had made some gardens with him in the south of India. And so again, it's just finding these people who can add value and add input, but really sort of share our values.
The third project that we're quickly showing a little bit of is a project that we started about a year ago in Bali. It's not, the construction will, like the actual construction will start in a couple of months, but our presence on site has already been established. We've built the full design as a one-to-one mock-up on site in bamboo, just to sort of have the frames of the buildings present on site. And partly that was because the site, the topography is quite steep and quite irregular. So it was for us a method to understand where trees are growing, or how the slope, where we need to cut, or where we can shift some buildings to have that work better. But it was also a way for the clients to understand the design, but also the structural engineer who we met on site for the first time, standing in this bamboo mock-up, and we could work together with him to resolve some of the structural issues. And we built this with a group of local farmers who were able to help us build these bamboo structures. And for us, that presence is also very important, that we established that relationship with the people who are from around where we're building. And we are the foreigners coming in and sort of ruining their peaceful village. But instead of doing that, we try to engage them and have their input also in the project.
And this is a photo of our small workshop in Mumbai. You can imagine it's space is at a premium in a city of 22 million people. And I think what, as Anna touched on earlier, what we really try and do is create, as designers, to create objects, artifacts, drawings, sketches that try and illustrate our ideas, but that really facilitate a dialogue. They're not explicit sets of instructions. They are things that are prompts, whether it's with the client or the builders or whoever it is, and then to try and create a space where these things can exist in our presence, whether it's on site or in our own space. And then to the idea of practice and intentionality, which I just wanted to very briefly touch on, is we've really thought about that, I think in a lot of ways, the way we think about our projects, as Anna mentioned, that we most of the time start before we really know where we're going. We have a sense for it, there's a framework, there's some really basic drawings or sketches, but we really try and sort of jump into that. And then as the context evolves and as we have all of the sort of parts in place to make the decision that we need to, we try and then pull the trigger and execute that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the front. Terrain architects from Japan. Where are you? Ah, okay. Okay. Terrain architects from Japan, to all of you.
Okay, good morning. My name is Ikko, and this is Fumi. We are co-founders of the Terrain Architects, which is a Tokyo-based firm established in 2011. We are currently working on the project in Japan, and Uganda in Africa. So for us, the definition of transnational is being balanced in relations between respecting the local people and maintaining our identity. The local identity and maintaining our identity. So we are going to talk about how we have designed the 6 years of our practice. So both of us were born, raised, and educated in Japan. So Fumi left Japan in 2006 after graduation and spent 1 year in Ireland working for Boyd Cody Architects and traveled many countries and a couple of places in Africa. And I left Japan during my studies and lived in Uganda for 1 year and also lived in Mali for a year. And I came back to Japan to finish my master course. I think it is one of the reasons why each of us travel, not to see a sort of famous architects designed by superstar architects, but to see more about local, usual architecture, respecting the people's lives. The picture shows the village where I stayed for a year in Mali. So it is called Teli Village of the Dogon. I was much interested in how people live in the village and how these houses are built by the local people. To know that, I stayed with the local people and tried to measure and record their houses. So we met first time on the survey trip in China in 2004 when we were master course students. It was for the measurement survey of Hakka housing. We are both excited to see like an architecture representing the context directly. We shared our interest in architecture without architects. Year 2010 was a pivotal year for us. A Japanese lady had an idea to build a small library in a remote village in Indonesia. And she had an interest in our unusual experience abroad. Then she asked us to design and supervise its construction. This project is a reason we decided to work with us as a team. It is an important project for us that we learned how to be involved in different contexts as architects, though the success and the errors of this project. At that time, Fumi was working as a research associate at the university, and I was working for a firm. We asked the client to give us as many opportunities as possible to visit the site instead of an amount of the money. So we didn't have any idea how much was the proper fee when architects design an architecture abroad. We visited the site, carefully observed it and its surroundings, and also collected information as much as possible. In different contexts, we found some similarities in the lives of the local people and our familiar custom, like eating, sitting, and sleeping on the floor. For us, usually use tatami mat, we call it floor intimacy. So this is the concept drawing. These are many small steps under one simple roof. So we try to develop an idea by this our cultural similarity for the project. So of course, using local materials and local labors were crucial. We can't access easily to this remote village. It should be maintained by the local people. So we try to achieve our idea while using local materials and labors. Then construction started. Many difficulties appeared. So one of them is about people. So there are so many misunderstandings with people who are involved in the project, like translator, contractor, and so on. So as a consequence, we lost extra time, energy, and money. So another one is in the communication. The picture shows its construction. So there was an internet communication tool like Skype in 2010, but it was not widely used. So it was hard to get timely information, though it was quite important. So we learned organizing a good team was quite important. So these pictures show library after completion. Though there were so many challenges for us, we think that the idea of our design was simple enough to transfer to local builders and attractive enough to children to maximize their ability to play with steps and floor. On reflection of the experience in Indonesia, when we got the opportunity to design and supervise a dormitory project in Uganda, we decided to put more time on this project. At that time, Fumi finished a full-time contract at the university, and she encouraged me to quit a farm for this project. So it was because we wanted to dedicate our time, energy, and passion to this exciting project. So we established our farm in 2011. So I had experience living there for a year in 2003, so we thought that was also an advantage for us. So there was not so much research except general information about architecture. We carefully collected the useful information which is reliable for finding what is possible on site. So we decided to deeply integrate ourselves into the local lifestyle. We are eating local food, speaking local language as much as possible, dancing with them, arguing with them, and so on. Of course, there are some difficulties that we don't experience in Tokyo, like frequent blackout, terrible traffic jam, and unpunctual people. But we could adapt, and we felt comfortable in their culture, climate, and custom.
So I visited there for the first time. It's in 2011, and I also like to live there. So as we had decided, we spent much time there on the reflection of the experience in Indonesia. But new problems emerged because we spent too much time there. We had got too close. We lost our outsider's view. So we realized it when we thought about problems, like because it is a dangerous place with many burglars, let's make boundary walls high. Or because there is strong sunlight and some heavy rain, let's close the building. So those were locally minded solutions in a bad way, I think. But things changed when I came back to Japan and I drew this drawing for some architecture exhibition. It represents a few things. So one is the strong contrast of sunlight and shade. And another is the seamless connection between inside and outside. And the people can walk through in and out of the shade along the walls. So what this drawing highlights is its climate and its brick walls. Both are too usual for local people. So what we have done is, I think, is extraction of the elements of the site, or I can say selection, rejection, pruning, and cleansing, to see the essentials with an outsider's view. And a little more about brick walls, one essential thing that we focused on. So local people take them for granted, recognizing them as cheap materials. However, we recognize them simply as beautiful regional elements. So we tested the strength of bricks at the laboratory of the university, Makerere University there. So it shows the weakness and instability as structural members. So we came up with an idea to using them as formwork of reinforced concrete and also finishing materials. And how we transferred the design to the local people is, so we prepared many physical models and drawings, and more importantly, both or either of us stayed at the site to communicate with local builders. So it was what we learned from the experience in Indonesia. And architects being on site is efficient way to us to build a good relationship with all the people working on the site. And another good thing is when we are on site, we ask ourselves many times, what are we doing? Or what we should do? Or who are we? Or some kind of identity questions. So it's a kind of a training to get confidence or struggle to get confidence during the long construction process. And in 2015, finally the dormitory completed and opened. So exposed brick wall were realized in its geography, right on the equator. And through the process of selection and piling bricks, masons, workers developed a kind of pride for local bricks that they had thought no value. And what made this possible is our outsider's view. Once we had lost it, we could find essential elements amongst usual, ordinary things. And we were satisfied with what we had done, but we wanted to do something new or more actively. So in 2015, before the completion of the dormitory, we organized a workshop. So we thought a workshop would be nice to see exploring what is possible in a different context. And through our experience in Indonesia, Uganda, and in Japan, we were convinced that the building something in a place with many constraints, like Uganda, the place we had our project, may be a good opportunity to redefine those constraints as essential elements or essential regionalism, which strengthen the outcome. So the process of the workshop, 2 days research, 2 days discussion from design, and 3 days construction. So nothing is special on its schedule, but 2 characteristic things we let students do. So one is to draw sketches, and even Ugandan students have smartphones with high-resolution cameras, but we let them draw sketches on the first day of observation. So one sketch at the center of this image is a little bit above. So close to the ground, there are vegetables with earth like tomato, carrots, and middle of the kiosk, there are leafy vegetables in vivid color to attract buyers, and spices are hung with strings above, and some chickens are in the cage underneath the seller's chair, not to escape. And above them, there is a corrugated roof offering shade against deterioration. So those were analyzed when they drew them, and those kiosks are very ordinary, very everyday building, and so many is there. But drawing sketches is a good way to make you cool down and keep your way a little bit away from what you're looking at. And another characteristic thing is, I think, to open the team to local. So this kind of small-scale kiosk can be fabricated by themselves. But we let them to find someone or some places to do each progress, like cut a plyboard, cut steel pipes, assemble parts, and so on. So they didn't bring their technique, but ideas how to make. So I think this is what we are doing. So our small firm makes more people involved and make a team bigger. So as a consequence, many people participate in the long process of architecture. So the final images show an ongoing project in Uganda. So this picture shows the carpenters, masons, gatekeepers, and also intern students, quantity surveyor, all are participating in this project. So 6 years have passed since we established our firm. This kind of network is what we also have established. So these people are whom we met at the previous project. So we are happy that new clients have seen or heard about how we were involved in the process and have visited the buildings we have designed. So now our firm is involved in some projects in Uganda and some in Japan. So there are commercial facilities like this, it's this Japanese restaurant, and educational facility and private houses. It all varies in scale and program. So though our physical office is in Tokyo, the number of projects in Uganda is increasing recently. So now our challenge is to figure out the proper sites for our firm. We are planning to hire more staff because the number of the project is increasing, but we want to keep the smallness of our firm. So why we want to keep our smallness is, firstly, we started our practice from the very small library, which was within 70 square meters. But we both love to think about small spaces, though the scale becomes bigger. And secondly, we want to dedicate our time to be on site. So this is for working with communities and for us to be more involved in the projects. So we think we are working to feel that we involve in the whole process. So this is a satisfaction. So at the end of this presentation, so when we work transnationally, so we want to keep in mind two things. So one is being balanced in respecting the local identity while maintaining our own identity to help our outsiders view, and also being balanced in collaboration with local people. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The third practice of this panel, Ingrid Moye and Christoph Zeller from Mexico City.
So thank you for the invitation again. We would like to talk a bit about the way we work, as others do or have done already. As you said, Juan, at the beginning, it's an intellectual exercise to establish a practice. And we were obviously at the same challenge at the beginning, and we decided, being actually in a condition of working for a practice at the time, how do we find out how we work together and how well we work together, apart from the fact that we work together in that firm, but how do we work together as authors? So we decided to do a series of case studies to test ourselves, and these are just the first two that we did, like a house, a tower, and other typologies. So for the house, we set ourselves a fictional plot. In this case, it's actually a lake in Mexico, and we decided to do a house along that lake. In this case, it is, as you can see, that a house actually becomes a little lake, and the roof is the swimming pool and all of this, so it reflects the surrounding. Don't want to go more into detail. The second case study is for a tower, and of course we were each time exploring the borders of that typology. So in this case, this was again a fictional plot. So we were extruding a certain territory into a tower shape that then led us to also thinking the tower differently. So for example, the core gets split up into individual necessary elements, and you obviously achieve something else than if you already have a brief to work from.
And, yeah. Another key element for us in our office that we didn't plan this, but it happened as we developed the office, is the collaboration aspect. We've been collaborating with different people, not just the typical things like engineers, of course, landscape architects, etc. But we've been collaborating a lot with artists. We didn't have this in mind at the beginning, but it's something we've been doing for more than 4 projects, I guess, in the office. And for example, this is a project that we completed last year in Bristol, in England, and it's a collaboration with a Scottish artist called Katie Patterson. And this is just to show you a little bit of the process. Basically, the image on the right is the built final image, and the one on the left is an image of the 3D model that we did in Mexico. Of course, we work in many ways with sketches, with drawings, with 3D models. But for example, in this case, we had to work very precise. I mean, in a way, when we work on projects in different continents, we sometimes have to develop actually rather a lot of work in the office to control and to understand as much as we can of the project and to communicate it as best to the other side of the world. So the communication with the artist was very much through Skype. Of course, we went there many times, but so that's why we developed this very detailed model where we, for example, this is a kind of grotto space where we had more than 10,000 species of woods, and each
individual piece of wood had to be modeled and accommodated. So it was a very refined and delicate work that we then had to translate, and luckily we got a really good team and a very good communication. So we managed to make the project almost one-to-one. And this is just to show you a little bit the sketches that we showed through Skype and through emails to communicate on one side with the artists, with the University of Bristol, where the project was done, and yeah, to communicate even what wood would go where, and even on site we would be taking Skype with the phone and communicating ourselves. To tell you a little bit about the project, just quickly, it's an permanent artwork in pavilion in the University of Bristol in England, and the commission was to host or to show a collection of wood of more than 10,000 different species, and we decided together with the artists to generate a kind of grotto space where you would exhibit the wood and a person would go in and look at all these species. Then this is another project where we had a collaboration with an artist. This is an open competition, international competition that we entered, and we won the first prize together with an artist, a German artist, Albert Baez, a very good friend of ours. And this is a memorial for Martin Luther. It's in the center of Berlin, just behind Alexanderplatz. And also something important to mention is the collaborations we've been doing with artists are not as in some cases that the artist conceptualizes a work and then he asks the architect to develop the piece. In these cases, the artists have been, in our opinion, perhaps a little bit overwhelmed with the scale of certain projects, and they've approached us because perhaps we're close friends, or in the case of Katie Patterson, they just found our work interesting, or I don't know, but so they've approached us to conceptualize a project, which has been a really interesting thing for us, to not start a project just thinking as an architect, but conceptualizing it intellectually together with the artist, and then developing the project. So in this case, for example, we're developing this memorial that is public space and is integrating light. And so in this case, we're working with high technology, developing new technology to have these LED fields in the floor, to have certain messages and quotes in relation to Luther's work. I won't explain you all the project because it's quite complex, but just that you get glimpses of the project. This is another case of a collaboration that 2 weeks ago we won first prize again. In this case, it is for the University of New Mexico State University, sorry. And this was an open competition again to enter with art. It was more an art competition. We entered together with an artist from Berlin. She's called Sarah Schoenfeld. And in this case, we had to design a piece, an element that would go into the technological laboratory. They call it like that, it's like a computer lab. And they gave us this wall, this large wall, where we had to put an artwork there. And in discussions with the artists, we decided to use the information or the knowledge of the university that is put in the hard disks. So we are actually melting the metal inside the hard disks, and we're impregnating some plates with this knowledge or with this metal, and with these we create this open field of vision in the space. So we play with the reflections to make new networks of communication and links within the laboratory.
Yeah, as a next point, perhaps it's interesting to talk about the process, how we tackle a design or tackle a task for an installation for a building. In this particular case, this is a screenshot of various models showing actually from the top left for a museum building for Mexico City. So how we start first with a massing, of course. I mean, this is
something you're very familiar with, I imagine, but then obviously through the breaking down, through the brief, etc., getting narrower and narrower towards a proposal, different ideas coming in, shapes start again from another direction, etc., until you actually arrive at the bottom right at the proposal. That then in this particular case is a multifaceted layered building that sits within a green park, so that's why it has this extensive outdoor areas, terraces, although it has a recessed core, a glazed core of exhibition space, but we really wanted to push here also the typology of your museum, how you exhibit, how you use a museum, because we were in the context of a park, so we said, let's use also the outside. Of course, this is for Mexico City. You have a moderate climate throughout the year, so you can actually do that. Especially for me as a European, this is a very exotic approach, and I found this very interesting to play with. The next project is a park with some buildings that we also entered a competition, an invited competition this year. And we won the proposal. So what you're seeing here is a 26,000 square meter park in the middle of Guadalajara. This is a new development, or whatever's white is actually getting built right now. It's one of the largest developments in Latin America at the moment. And the park itself is a collaborative process with lots of different parties. So in this particular case, we worked actually with Arab, the engineers, with the group that we still knew from our work at Herzog Dimmeron. So with the same group, we actually collaborate on several projects. And in this particular case, we did together as authors the design. And instead of just providing a inhabitable green space, we actually asked ourselves, what is a park in the sustainable matter, and how could you design a park sustainable, or is a park in itself already sustainable because it's just growing by itself? So we figured actually a park is almost like a building. It has to be maintained. It's very difficult to realize. And in this case, we actually incorporated for example, the stormwater design in the form of a dry riverbed that then gets flooded at times, and it contributes to the landscape. So this is like a miniature version of Mexican landscapes, of course, local plants, local species, etc. But the engineering is inherent in the proposal, and this gives you a glimpse of the complexity of it. So the park itself obviously, grows, also dies off certain parts. We create biomass. And with the biomass, we fuel also the cooling of the auditorium, which is underground. So this whole thing becomes a very complex system that tries to be a benchmark ecological project as a park together with public buildings. And this could only be possible in the collaboration with engineers, of course, because we don't have the in-depth knowledge. And obviously, the engineers themselves couldn't do it themselves just like that either. So it's only the joint effort that makes this happen. These are photos of another project that we're doing actually, which was mentioned before in Kurdistan in Iraq, the Kurdish part of Iraq, which is obviously at the moment, sadly, has other problems than constructing buildings. And nevertheless, this is an ongoing process for several years. We got the commission by a German NGO in 2013 to do a memorial in the middle of a desert. The memorial is for a genocide that Saddam Hussein committed on the Kurds in 1988. It's called Anfal. And we were commissioned to do a proposal for a memorial. So what you see here is actually the ongoing conversation, the constant convincing of various parties. On the top, for example, is a meeting in Berlin at the Foreign Ministry because they are supporting the project. On the left, more different delegations coming to Germany, us going to Kurdistan. Since this is also a bottom-up project, we are working obviously very closely with the clients, which in this case are the survivors, mainly women, in their 50s, 60s. So you see a picture here in the middle. And doing lots of political agitation almost towards the project to make it happen. So we find ourselves as architects, actually as the authors of a proposal in the middle of this process. And in order to make this happen, we have to participate in this. Otherwise, it would not work.
and it would not make a step further. And this is actually the proposal. It's worked around an artwork that we arrange in a circle. It's photographs of the survivors. And in the middle we have this message in a way that obviously symbolizes, to start with, the void, but then grows into a park or into a garden that's alive, into a new landscape, as a signal of hope, perhaps. And all the program is developed around it, around the ring, as there is archives, galleries, etc., etc.
And something that is really important for inner practice for every project, even if it doesn't matter if it's in Mexico or abroad, the scale of the project, it's been the materialization of the projects. And with this I mean that we have a very careful development of the project since the beginning, since the conceptual phase, but we are very interested in how we translate that information into the realization. And we achieve this, or we try to achieve this, through understanding as much as we can of the project through the architectural means that we have, that are drawings, 3D models, other types of softwares, etc., but also being on site. Even if it's in Mexico or in other countries, we see it in the same way. And we're very interested also in working with projects that perhaps don't have the largest budgets. And for example, we are an office that is not so interested in selecting materials from a catalog that many other offices might do, and we of course do, but we like very much the idea of rethinking the materiality of the projects, very specific to each one. And this is, for example, a very small showroom that we designed in Mexico City, and we had a very small budget, and we decided to use very simple materials that are coming rather from factories or that are used for other things, not necessarily for what we are designing, and this gives us a lot of room to play and to design. This is, for example, a house that we completed beginning of this year, also in Mexico City, and here we worked. We were very interested in integrating craftsmanship, of course. I mean, in Mexico, this is one of the things we have and we love to use. And we designed this floor that is used inside and outside the house is the same surface. And we worked with local marble to create this kind of terrazzo that is kind of like playing with the landscape and with the house itself. And we also develop, for example, this object or this product that it's a standard clay brick or block, and we are applying a kind of artisanal or craftsmanship work to it, that is this metallic cladding, and we're developing together with some local craftsmanships in Guadalajara, or near Guadalajara actually. So we're developing a kind of catalog of these blocks, and we're trying to generate a product that can be sold also in stores, same as when you buy the standard block, but having this additional local value, and people can use it for anything they want. It's not just for our projects, but we're trying to bring this out in the market. And this is, for example, a project it's coming out from a project we did in San Galen. It's an exhibition design we were commissioned to do this year. It was for the Textile Museum in San Galen, and it was an exhibition on technology of textiles. And we were commissioned to design all the exhibition, but also including all the furniture. So we developed a catalog of objects that were tables, plinths, walls, etc. And we thought that the material of these objects had to be related to the technology of textiles. So we actually found a product that just came out to the market that is a fabric concrete. So it's a mix of certain fibers that is made into a concrete, very thin plate that we were able to work with as if it was a fabric. So, I mean, I won't go into detail of how it works, but the point is that we were able to make these almost draped shapes and objects that looked like fabrics and were as thin as fabrics, but were very strong, and we were able to put very large, heavy objects on top of. So this exhibition is still ongoing. And then for example, this is a small shop we did in Mexico City. It was a very limited budget, one of the first projects we did actually, and a very complicated existing space. So we liked and enjoyed very much this experience of working with very few means. And we decided to use, for example, local wood to create a skin that will allow us to let some light into the space, to also have certain views outside and let some views in every now and then. And we worked also with local craftsmanship to use copper. We selected copper as a metal that we will use all throughout the store. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One more chair?
Yes.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. It's also always interesting to, group people around themes as broad as, transnational or, and obviously you're quite varied in your practices and approaches, but I'm going to try to sort of thread commonalities, maybe more in the attitude rather than in the work, and try to be somewhat polemical so that we can extract some kind of reflection. Clearly, I think all of you, and I would say probably will find throughout the day that whatever that division between local and global, we're much beyond that now, and everybody is operating in a very networked, very informed, very agile way. But I think it's interesting to figure out how that is possible, rather than just claim that we're beyond that. I would say that there is maybe a sense of retreat that one finds in the let's say how you've articulated or positioned the practices. I mean, if I think of the 80s or the kind of retreat into academia that happened here in the US, where the world was moving too fast, or there was a kind of sense of the commercialization, or for whatever reason, there was a kind of return to the disciplinary that happened really within the walls of academia. It seems to me that if I just look at the three practices, there is a kind of retreat, but that's different, right? It's either retreating. It's just interesting that at the moment where we're still talking and we're still experiencing, global urbanization, high-speed transformation, issues of migration, like all these, climate change, your position is we're going to work in a small rural village and build a library, or we fell in love with Mumbai. And I mean, just hearing you speak, there was a kind of, I was thinking about slow food. There was like, our resistance is that we're just going to learn to eat again, actually, and take pleasure in the taste. Or, I think you, in your case, you're a little bit more in between, but nevertheless, there's a kind of radical, there's a choice. Well, we may not be in a rural village, but we're going to work in Mexico, which is extremely dense and exciting, but still, there's a kind of hybrid, possibility. So that there's a kind of sense of retreat There's obviously, and this is maybe more the result of the time of the practice versus which is the engagement with scale. Small is good. You know, small is another form of resistance, or I think that, you know, if Rem still like, you know, pose the question of scale as the fundamental problem for architects for the future, you're like, nope, no, actually, really, we're not so interested. And I want to kind of open that up a little bit. Craft is definitely a way to move beyond the local and the global, right? Reconnecting with making and materiality and how things are made, and whether you're engaging with kind of the labor as part of the design process, or local materials, or finding materials, or, you know, that craft is the way out of that issue. But there's also then, as a result of craft becomes, it seems to me, takes the place of history, in that the only history that's interesting is the context, the climate, how things are made. It's the vernacular history, not the disciplinary history. There's none of you mentioned, besides having worked at another practice before, there isn't the sense of a legacy historically. Of engaging, and again, I'm being very polemical here, and there's a kind of, well, we're starting from scratch a little bit, and we're kind of relearning the basics. Collaboration, of course, is critical, I think, and it's, you know, the more minds come together, the better it is, and I see that, you know, it's very interesting to see it in our students. I would say that 10 years ago, maybe students wanted to work individually, and now they actually seek to work in teams, and there is a kind of complete shift of how the creative process happens. And but I was very intrigued by the fact that collaboration doesn't mean, oh, we have to collaborate with only local artists so that we can, no, it's like, that's my network, you know, we need color, we're gonna, and so there's a kind of lack of self-consciousness, which I think is very refreshing, and there is a sense, nevertheless, that the practices are also operating somewhat as art practices. I mean, because of the scale, the engagement with the materiality, with making, with, you know, being on site. You were also saying being on site, and there's this kind of re-engagement. And as a result, you know, before Ingrid and Christoph, I was going to say also no competitions. Like, if there was 2 generations ago, it was all defined by competitions. And I know you're entering competitions, so I'm going to change that from no competition to very little speculative work. You know, you're not spending your time thinking through speculation, thinking through questions of representation. The model is a tool to build. It's not an object that is architecture in itself. So in that sense, for me, it's also a kind of rejection of a whole historical moment that, you know, claimed representation as the object of architecture, almost. Process versus product. Right? I mean, I know that it's also the theme of the day is to think about the process, but you know, there's no. You are a little bit more object-oriented, but you are all of you very process-oriented, and part of the pleasure is in the process. But nevertheless, the idea of realization is really key. So these were my sort of reflection on if we took 3, you know, of groups to think through, and so I guess the big questions for me are, what would you agree that there's a sense of retreat, or, you know, like, is the choice of operating at a certain scale or in a certain place, is that really a choice, or is it actually a result of losing so much agency that the only place we can actually act is in a rural village in Uganda as architects, because we no longer are at the table of big decisions that are shaping our cities, you know? So is that an active kind of finding a site of agency, or is it more like we have really very little space to go? And so that would be my first question. And related to that is the question of scale. How I remember Andres Lepek, maybe some of you know his small scale big change at MoMA, which was a show that he did in I think 2010, which kind of was really interesting. But is that true? Does small imply big, and is that even important that we engage with those big issues of scale? So, and then the third, so the first is the question of retreat and agency. The second is the question of scale, and the third would be this sense of your engagement with the discipline and its history, whether that's even relevant or interesting, or whether there's a kind of, in a way, very modernist kind of rediscovery of, well, let's just learn how to build again with what we have, where we are, for certain needs, and there's a kind of freshness in that act of moving away from a kind of critical introspection of the discipline.
Perhaps I start. In regards to scale, I would say the moment you start your practice, obviously there isn't often a choice. It's like, I don't know if I speak for everyone, but in our case it was literally like that. We had to also see what comes up. And it's not that we say we don't want to do big buildings. I think we're very open. It's a dynamic process also how to build a practice. I don't think that, I speak for us now, of course, there's something bad about large scale. There's nothing fantastic about small scale. Both exist, and I think in our practice, what we didn't show maybe so much was also we do very small scale up to the door lever. We design, and this is something that we can do in Mexico because of the craftsmanship that was mentioned, because of the possibilities that are based on the fact that people have a very economic labor rate to work, which is impossible in Europe. I mean, this is a high-end luxury, what we're talking, if you do a similar thing. From that perspective, I think it happens that we work in small scale. We're also growing. I mean, you saw one competition now at Park, so actually it's jumping quite a lot from various scales. I think that's in a way.
But I would say, and I want to hear everybody, I would say though that you could be working on small scale but speculating on big scale. But speculation is not something, maybe the question of scale is more interesting in terms of the question of speculation, whether speculation in your practices is something that is important.
Yeah, I think for us, I would mirror that it sort of came about, you sort of take what comes to you. The first project we got was the school, which is, for me, the largest project I've ever worked on. It's 200,000 square feet. It's a 4-acre campus.
It's also still the largest project that we've done so far.
Yeah,
and it's pretty large. I mean, I'm not.
Well, but in terms of the size of it and duration, at the same time we're working on, we made these small brass dias that we did in 2 weeks, and so while that's happening, we're working on something that is going to take 10 years, and. Yeah, I think for us, we've always been, and I don't want to speak for Anna, but I've always been very interested in the process leading to something that's physically manifested. So the notion of speculation has just, I think, personally been something that I haven't pursued. Sure. But I think that engagement there's a richness in that engagement of process of making that was something that we sort of
That's very clear.
chased.
Yeah.
I mean, now that you speak about process, and this was not specifically a question, but you touched the point, I think to me, and perhaps I talk from both of us, is one of the things that I found most difficult in the practice is to convince clients, which can be people, individuals, or government, or institutions, to convince people or to make them understand of the architectural process. And with this, I don't speak just about Mexico. I really see this as a problem everywhere. And it's the value that, or the work that is behind the final product that they see that they normally cannot understand. Mm-hmm. And for us, coming from practices where process is really important. We worked for Herzog and Meron and Sana, both of us, where the process was a key element of design, and there will be a lot of time spent on the design process. And then when you open your own practice, you are willing to go on with this very analytical process, and then you face clients that tell you, okay, you have 3 weeks, but you need to do 2 models, 5 panels, blah, 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 blah. No? So the time that you have to produce that work is being eaten, and where is your design process left? So this is something that has been taking a lot of effort and a lot of time to convince clients, government, and institutions on this intellectual process that is very difficult to grasp or to understand the real value of this.
So for us, the process of let me talk about the scale.
Yeah.
So that we just started at the opportunity to design the small library, but I think the scale is relating to the, how can I say, the opportunity. Just, because now there are so many small the project in also Uganda, but for us like young architects, I think compared to the Japan and Asia, there is few architects like us. So I think there are some opportunity to get the bigger scale. But for when we look at the process of our design, I think there is not so big difference for us, because now that we also see the small scale of the details and the project. So yes, of course there is the different scale of the project, but for our processes be the same, or almost same as architects.
So it's finding more opportunity, whether there's kind of access to labor in Mexico that's skilled, or whether you can really engage with making. And so making is really sort of a key kind of...
perhaps for us, what we find interesting in living in a way in both worlds, because we also come from both worlds. Sure. Ingrid's Mexican, I'm German, but we do operate from Mexico, but we do operate from there also 2 other parts of the world, and vice versa. And anyway, we've worked in various different companies in various different continents, even various different cultures. So we have our network also spread out. So when I was mentioning that we work with Arab, it's because it's almost the first engineer I would call up if I have a question, and they sit in London, and because I used to work with them for 8 years, so it's a natural reflex almost. And I think this is perhaps we are one of the first generations to experience this, that we have these networks that are not just local, but actually global. And how can you actually execute work with such a network when you're a specialist, as I think you were saying, that you have a landscape architect in New Zealand, but you work, for India, and this is something totally common for us and natural for us.
Yeah, no, I think it's been common for some time. I think maybe the difference is choosing to move to a place where access to, where you might have more opportunities, or versus. It's not so easy to just move to Uganda or to decide Mumbai is going to be the place from which I'm going to operate because I love it. Like that's a next step of saying I could actually be anywhere and learn, right?
Yeah, for sure. But I would say to the students out there, I went to Mumbai as a grad student. I had no preconception of what it would be or what I would find there or what I would study or who I would end up working with. And so it really was a sort of, I don't want to say an easy transition, but it was something that was quite intuitive, and it just sort of, at every point that I had to decide to go or stay or come back or do something else, it just sort of felt natural to continue on that path. And so in that sense, it sort of was easy in a way that I think it wasn't, a couple of generations ago. The connectivity, relationships with family, things like that is quite seamless now, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I think it's also interesting, to the sense of acceleration that Ingrid, you've been talking about, I think that there was a time when architects had more time, and now we have less time. And so it's interesting for me, those of you who, or even in the previous panel, those who teach and use the kind of academic sort of space as the space of research to think through some of the problems so that you can actually operate within the shorter time, or practices that, this is where the speculative part I was interested in, because often we no longer are able to speculate with the projects that were given. We speculate with other projects, and then the ideas kind of come back into the, I have 3 weeks to make a model. I mean, in your case, I think that's kind of interesting. But I think you guys are making a very different choice, which is, very much engaged in the kind of building process as the practice itself, which is quite interesting. And in that case, I would say, how would you then reflect on architecture education today in terms of preparing, the students or our graduates to, if representation is no longer really the site of investigation, because what we do here is we draw, right? I mean, it's not that we're making, but it's not that the kind of one-to-one scale. I mean, would you advocate for an architecture education that is re-engaging construction as kind of fundamental to architecture or building practice? Or I'm just curious whether your experience now would kind of shape how you would think about an architectural education.
I studied in Delft, and the part of the construction part of
it's very strong there.
Yeah, but also the very different way than how we practice now. And but what is very strong is we had a huge model making workshop, and so the making part of architecture, whether that's maybe not so much in how it's actually being built, but just the physical act of making models, which also trains or helps you as a student to understand how things are built. That was very strong, and I think that's both of us have also been involved in teaching in Mumbai, where we try to have students also work in that way, and trying to not only think about ideas on paper or conceptualize it, but also about how it's being made. Yeah.
Right. So I was graded at Tokyo University of the Arts, so there was the watercolor painting for the entrance examination. So they finished it, but it was nice to redefine the drawing sketches or the pictures, so to communicate with the local laborers. That was wonderful, because I didn't realize it before I brought 3 brave students from Japan to Uganda to have that kind of workshop. But they drew well, and also it's kind of the analyzing the observation of that site. So that kind of things that make us rethink about that, how to communicate or how we think our ideas. So that was interesting for us.
Right.
I think the drawing is still very relevant. I think it's key. And coming back to the subject transnational, we experienced that we actually have to plan almost more than if we were in the place where we are constructing. It's a form of communication, of course. In the case of the wooden grotto, it was literally that we decided to make a 3D model in one-to-one. Of course, we could have taken a different approach, let it happen random, but it's perhaps not our way to do this also. And it was too complex what we wanted to achieve, so we really decided to go very much into the detail. Of course, with the local testing, etc. But I would say that this is still very relevant, and it will become perhaps, or hopefully even more relevant. I would also include the model making, all these abstract forms of representation of trying out, rather than just the one-to-one, because the one-to-one is purely the local, I think. Right. How do you do the one-to-one 500 kilometers away? I think you need a tool to control that or to arrange it.
Making.
I think so.
Maybe we have time maybe for one question.
First of all, congratulations on wonderful work, all of the groups. So a common thread between all of you is that you have grown up in more developed countries, and I would say more of structured cultures or societies, and have gone back to or gone to a different culture where the way of work is a lot more organic. From economy-wise, the countries are more developing. So I'm curious to know what are the biggest advantages that you have going from this world to that world, and what are the biggest disadvantages that you faced perhaps just one that you could all have picked. And second question, which is unrelated, is do you have a fear of this kind of transition weaning off in a time, or having a much stronger pull towards your roots? And will you be able to kind of go back to wherever you came from and be, have you ever thought of it? Just curious.
Well, sorry, if I could speak to the first one, and I think it also ties back to some of your questions. One of the things, I don't know if it's an advantage or disadvantage, but one of the things that we're very strongly aware of in practicing in India is that the idea of the profession of architecture really only came with the British. It only arrived, it's only been there for 100, 150 years, whatever that history is. But at the same time, we work with carpenters who are 60th generations. Fathers, we're all carpenters. And the tacit knowledge and the opportunity to sort of work with that skill for us is both an unbelievable opportunity, but it's also humbling in the sense that we rely on them and we learn from them, and we incorporate their sort of expertise into what we do, and it just sort of, I think one of the things we've learned very quickly is that if we can find, again, those people that share values, you can really exponentially amplify what it is you're trying to create in the physical world when you sort of incorporate those kinds of really rich and deep histories, which I think, again, it's this conflict of academia versus what I would call tacit knowledge, that as long as you sort of agree socially that you're trying to sort of swim in the same direction, it's a really sort of powerful, not just experience in relationship to the process, but also what can be created out of that.
And for example, speaking of myself, I was raised and mainly educated in Mexico, and then moved away for more than 5 years between Spain, Tokyo, Switzerland, England, and then moved back to Mexico. And this was a deliberate decision. We actually quit the paradise, working in a, like an amazing company in Switzerland, and having a really nice life, etc., and going back to my own country. And the surprise when I moved there was that a lot of my colleagues and friends were really against the idea of me moving back to Mexico, like moving back, this idea of going back, which for me was the opposite thing. For me was, I saw there an opportunity, and I wanted strongly to go there. So this is something that they never understood, and I strongly believe in that it was the right decision to base our office there. And I think what it has given me the time that I was abroad is that I think I'm able to see the reality in Mexico in a more neutral way, where I'm not so, let's say, I don't see it perhaps in such a romantic way of idealizing the historical, very strong background, but to see it in a more neutral way. And I think I'm able to better understand the balance between pros and cons, I think. And because I think that in the moment you are away and you kind of give value to a lot of things from your own country, or this is at least what I do. But at the same time, I think I'm able to see a lot of disadvantages. And I think the way I try to work with this is to stay quite flexible. So, of course, I mean, I have a German partner where we worked in Japan and in Switzerland. We know how to do waste in a certain way, but we need to stay very flexible and kind of fluid to work with a place like Mexico, which doesn't work like that necessarily. So it's been a challenge. It is always a challenge, but yeah. Go on.
What I found very enriching is, and I think your observation is very true, that you say we are going to a very dynamic, or a place with a very different dynamic. This is certainly true. Coming from Germany, and coming back to the competitions, when you want to enter competitions, you find you're just not able to do it because you haven't have the history of 2 years of earning 2 million, turnover 2 million a year, and 10 and so forth. No? So you basically find yourself kind of outside. And I think that's really a problem in Europe, honestly. I think Switzerland, for example, has already a better system, allowing young practitioners also to participate in the process. Germany is very bad in this, I think, and many other European countries too. And we saw, obviously, coming from that perspective, a very different dynamic in Mexico, very different expectations also. Which we enjoy. Likewise, seen from the Mexican perspective, we have also projects in Europe, in Germany, let's say, and we almost come with a Mexican approach to these projects. Like, can we now try something else? Think beyond the box. Don't think just in products. Specify products, the door, the wood, I don't know. Think in what is the wood, and to itemize it then again. And I think that's, in a way, the nice symbiosis that we're finding, that it influences both perspectives and both sides. All the work actually is affected somehow that we're doing, regardless where it is.
So that makes me think that actually, in some ways, the architectural practice is more like an art practice, in that artists always have kind of immigrated to whether they went to Berlin when New York became too expensive, or there's a sense of finding the place where you can actually start to engage in the ways that you can engage. And of course, architects were always 20 years later. So it's interesting for me that this maybe is not the retreat I was talking about, but more finding agency in the place that you can grow from. Thank you all. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lunch is in the back of